Hello and welcome back. I invite you to bring out your sketchbook, your drawing tablet, whatever you might be working on traditionally, digitally, and join me for some art time. Or just feel free to have this on in the background with whatever you were originally doing. But I know some people like it when I invite them to draw along with me and it encourages them a little bit. So here's your encouragement. Today I am illustrating a raven. I think it was 2 videos ago, did a sketchbook page of raven studies in order to prepare for this illustration. But way before that, there is a sketch in one of my sketchbooks that was the starting idea for this illustration. And one thing I like to do in my sketchbooks is through either thumbnails, really loose sketches, but also sometimes more finished sketches, if you want to use that word. I try to get as many ideas down as I can when I feel them. Sometimes it's even just in writing. I might write down an idea. It can be anything from that through to an almost like fully sketched out idea, and it can sometimes be months later, years later in some cases, that I'll eventually get around to exploring them as a painting or as an illustration, or I'll redesign them in a new way, but I'll in some way use old sketches to create new illustrations. And this is what happened with this. So I had a sketch in one of my sketchbooks from earlier in the year. I think it was at least a few months ago that I did the sketch, and it's of a raven with a ribbon that was tied around its head, almost like a blindfold, but now it's coming loose and it can see again, and a string wrapped around its feet that's also starting to come loose. That was the initial idea. Once I had finished an illustration and I was considering what I wanted to work on next, I came across this sketch again and I felt like this was the time to do it, so I gathered up a bunch of reference and I started studying ravens, both just like looking at them, learning about them factually, learning about them visually, and then also sketching them as well, which is where that video came into play as well. One of the main things that I tried to apply from what I learned about ravens through the research, through the sketching and so on, into this illustration versus the first sketch I did, was really trying to pay attention to its chest feathers when I was painting, because one of the main characteristics that sets apart ravens from crows is that ravens tend to have more prominent chest feathers, chest plumage. When I was doing the later stages of the painting, you'll see me trying to layer the watercolors so that you can kind of see tufts of feathers in the chest. So that's one thing that I tried to keep in mind from all of the initial sketch through to research and then getting to this stage. Maybe sharing that will help some people with how you might want to apply research in your practices, maybe. But otherwise, maybe it'll just be interesting for you to hear how I do it. There's a plethora of different ways people can do illustrations, and I always find it fascinating learning about how uniquely each person applies things to their practices, and what works for them, what will work for some people and not for other people. And yeah, it's interesting. So I'd like to share how it works for me over here, and sometimes that might help people. Sometimes some people will find that what I do completely doesn't work for them, and that is cool. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is, like, try and figure out what works for you, because you are not going to fit into the exact same art shoes as another person, and trying to find out what you need helps out tremendously in the long run. But anyway, back to the original point. I started off with a pencil sketch, which you saw a little bit of, and I'm working on a newer paper to me, so I got this block a few months ago. I haven't really gotten around to using it that much, so this is the Master's Choice line by Baohong, and it is a hot press version, and I haven't tried the cold press in this line. This is the only block from the Master's Choice that I got, and it is 10 by 7 inches. I have tried the ones that have like a red orange-ish cover and also the green cover that are from the Academy line, which are the more like student kind of grade, even though they're still 100% cotton, and they're okay to paint on. They're not my favorite to paint on, but they're okay to paint on. So I was interested to try out the Masters line to see if there was any like improvement in quality and if it was any different. I will note that one of the main things that immediately was obvious to me was that the texture is still very similar to the Academy line, which makes sense. The hot press texture on both this and the Academy is a lot more rough than other kinds of hot press papers that I normally use. It's almost starting to lean towards like a smooth cold press. It's that textured, so just bear that in mind if this is a paper that you're interested in picking up. If you want a really smooth hot press paper, this probably isn't for you. If it doesn't bother you as much, or if you like to have it smooth enough to do inking on but rough enough that you get interesting like almost cold press paper textures with the watercolour, it might be worth trying out, but meh, either way. One thing I did notice though, and you'll see me having to move around the pigment a lot, is that I had a really hard time getting the paint to sink into the paper. I tried one other painting before this, which I ended up scrapping, and I noticed that a little bit on that painting. So this is the second sheet of this block that I've used. Yeah, it's not something that I've noticed with the Academy line. It might just be that it's the first few sheets that do this. I'll find out as I get further along, but I did have to constantly move the pigment over the same area until it started to kind of sink in to the paper. Otherwise it was all beading up, almost like it was set on plastic. But once I kind of moved it around a bit, it was working as intended. So just a little bit of figuring out the paper and what its needs are, but that's, you know, something that you'll come across as you try new things. Sometimes you'll find things that you end up really loving, sometimes you find things you hate, and sometimes you just have to make things work. So this was a making things work kind of illustration, but I did enjoy the process of this. I really enjoyed painting this. Also inking it as well, but this was one of those where it felt like it was in the early stages for a very long time, and then towards the end I could start seeing all of the layers come together. When I was putting down like the final 2 layers, it was all starting to come together, and it was so satisfying. And putting down the final thing at the end, which I'll get to when it happens, was one of the most satisfying moments for me. But one thing you'll notice on the palette is that I've got 4 puddles of different pigments, and from bottom to top, and there is a reason for that, we have yellow ochre, and then Prussian blue, then brown red, which is PBR 25, and then Dioxazine violet. So the reason why I'm leaving that top one to last is because in my last video I was talking about the palette that I'm using here and how I have been revisiting it and changing it to suit my current painting needs, and also for some future painting goals for the end of this year and then going into 2025. Because the palette here is one of my oldest palettes. It's my oldest well-based palette, and it kind of fell by the wayside for a long time, and now that I'm needing to use it as my main palette again, and I won't go over all the reasons for that again, but the reason why I am changing it is because this is now going to be my main everyday palette, and not all of the pigments that were on it are pigments that I need anymore. So those got switched out, and I put them in little full pans and stored them in my like palette storage box, and put in some new pigments, and then I experimented to see if I needed to make any final changes, and I did end up finding out that I didn't want one of the pigments on the palette, and this is the result of more experimenting. I decided that I'm putting Dioxazine Violet on this palette, and I used it in some of this painting, mainly for the underpainting, not so much in later stages, pretty much for all of the rest of this painting, of the bird specifically. I used just 3 colours. I used the brown red, Prussian blue and Indanthrone blue, and I tried to switch between the warm and the cool of the blue versus the brown, but also the warm and cool variations of the 2 blues to deal with the vast majority of the raven. The exception to that was with the string and with the ribbon. So for the ribbon, you'll see me occasionally bring out 3 primaries, and those were PY150, which is Nickel Azo Yellow, PV19, which is Quinacridone Rose, and I believe I used Indanthrone Blue for the blue, which is PB60. That was just to have some colour variation in the ribbon, because I wanted the ribbon to be sort of a very pale cream white kind of colour. And when you're painting things that are white or are very, very pale colours like cream, ivory, usually there's a lot more colour variation than you realise, and having some of those colour shifts adds a bit more dimension into painting really, really light subjects. So yeah, that's the reasoning for why I'm using primary-ish colours here. It's not a traditional primary, it's not like your usual colours, because yes, I'm using a magenta-ish colour, but then I'm not using a cyan blue, but it's a blue, a yellow and a red. But yeah, for the rest of it I was mainly using just the 2 blues and the red brown. One of the main struggle points I had with using those 3, so we're talking about the blues and the browns here, the blues and the brown, is that 2 of those tend to cauliflower very readily. So rather than struggle with that, I embraced it, and I tried to make it part of the texturing of the washes that I was laying down. And I knew that I wanted to go in and do a lot of layering, not like tons and tons of layering, but a fair amount of layering. So I wanted to not stress too much about how each layer ended up, and instead focus on the fact that I was going to be doing a few layers, and anything that I put down I would take advantage of, rather than fussing or worrying or trying to fight the characteristics of the paint that I'm using. One thing that you'll see me do a lot from this moment onwards is softening off the edges. So I'll place down some colour with one brush, and then I'll use another brush, or sometimes I do it all with the same brush. It just depends on how I'm feeling and what I intuitively pick up. But I will use my brown handle brush that you can see me holding to soften off the edges. So I either always use that brush to put down the paint and to soften, or you'll see me place down the paint with the blue handled brush and then soften it with the brown handled brush. So the reason why I'm using the brown handled brush to soften is because it is my softest brush. And when you're softening your edges, having a really soft brush makes it a lot easier. It holds more water, but it also allows you to have more control about how little or how much water you have in the brush. I find that it results in much nicer and easier stress-free, or at least less stress, softening. And that is why my brown handle brush I use pretty much exclusively for softening, but sometimes I will also use it for the actual painting stage as well. If I'm really in the flow of doing a lot of putting it down, softening, putting it down, softening, putting it down, softening, I usually have 2 brushes dedicated to what I'm doing, and I'll keep the one I'm not using in my left hand and then switch out. So I'll have like a blue one that I'm putting down the paint with, switch it out, and then switch it back again, and that'll be when I'm doing things like the texture in trees and things where I am going back and forth between the two quite quickly. For this though, apart from some of the feathers, I was doing quite large areas, so I didn't feel the need to have 2 brushes in my hands at once, and I was kind of just putting one down, picking it up again when I needed it, and it was a lot more slow but yet still intentional and relaxed, rather than doing a lot of more intricate kind of placing of paint. It was more so that kind of painting towards the end, towards the very, very final layers, especially when doing the feathers on the main body and the chest of the raven. I nearly said the wrong animal. I kept saying the wrong animal in the last video, even though I knew what I meant to say, but my brain was just like, no, we're gonna say this one. And it wasn't until I was watching the footage for editing that I realized that I had said the completely wrong animal. It happens so frequently. I've spoken to some of my other art friends who do videos, and they say all the time that they will think of a certain thing and think that they're saying that, but then when they go back and watch the footage, they just say something completely different, and then it's like, oh no, because you're not going to go back and record everything again. You're just gonna have to live with my funny mistakes, and yeah, they can be little Easter eggs for you to hunt and find. But it is a blessing and a curse of listening to yourself after recording and then going back and editing. But that's a whole other topic, is getting comfortable with filming yourself and recording and editing and things like that. That's a whole thing. Let's see what else has been going on recently. I've been doing a few different illustrations and exploring different media as well. I've been practicing more with digital and trying to understand how I would incorporate digital into my practice. It's something that I occasionally dip in and out of, but I don't really have like a solid method for how I approach illustrations in there, and I want to try and develop that, and that's something I've been doing outside of what you may see over here, just because I don't really have a setup that works with showing you digital art. Like, I can always do time lapses as shorts, but yeah, it's something that that doesn't get shared over here too much, but I can at least share with you what I have been intending to do and how that's going. So I have discovered a process that I'm enjoying, and I want to keep developing that. So I have found that I really enjoy using gouache brushes for the painting, and then I've figured out what inking tools I like to use. So one benefit of digital illustration is that I can do the inking and then use digital gouache, but gouache underneath it, which I can't do in traditional media because of gouache being opaque. I would have to do the inking last. So being able to have the textures, or at least digital representations of gouache textures underneath inking, has been really fun digitally. And it's a way for me to kind of have things that are unique to each tool that I use, but with some overlap. And that's been really fun to discover. Outside of art recently, I played the Monster Hunter Wilds demo, which was really fun. I played the early one on PlayStation, and I really enjoyed it. I'm excited for when that comes out. But I came across a few bugs and issues once it opened up to PC and Xbox in the like full beta. I was trying to attempt doing a hunt solo, which was already a decision, but I was trying to do it solo, and it was for the like lightning monster. I was getting it down. I was being a good hammer girl and nearly got it down, but then suddenly it said that my character has left the party. Remember, I'm solo, but the notification has left the party, and then my character disappeared, but my camera stayed the same. My palico disappeared, but I could still see the monster running around as if it was being attacked, and I could hear my palico talking like it was still attacking the monster. I couldn't access any of my menus, and yeah, that was an interesting bug. I had to like back out and fully close the game, but it was kind of funny just seeing the monster like fighting the ghost of my palico. Was a very it was an interesting bug, at least. Now on the painting you can see me applying some pretty bright blues, and those do settle down because of the drying shift. That's both from the Prussian blue and from the Indanthrone blue. I have a watch of where I place down some of those blue areas and then watch it dry as I'm working on other areas, and you'll see how much of that saturation disappears as it dries. It's something I'm used to now, working with Prussian blue way back in the day and then Indanthrone blue for the last, I think, couple of years. It was very easy for me to get back into the flow of painting with Prussian blue again because I've been so used to painting with Indanthrone for so long now. It was very easy to slip back into painting with that again, and it's just something you have to bear in mind. Sometimes it can be quite intimidating when you're putting down what looks like a very, very saturated blue, and then it just ends up melding together with the rest of the piece, or becoming way less saturated than you're intending if you're not quite as used to painting with it. It's still something that takes some adjusting for sometimes, but I kind of just trust the process now whenever I'm doing something like this. And that's kind of the middle stage area, and then I'm going in with the darks for the final stages, which you're seeing me do now, or at least starting to do. I do kind of go back and forth with adding the blues and then doing some of the darks. But for the darks, I'm mixing some kind of warm neutral tones and some cooler neutral tones by mixing the brown with one or both of the blues, and that way I can adjust it around a little bit and have some colour variation throughout the bird, because there's certain areas where I want it to be cooler or warmer, like the top of the head. I want to have more of a warmth to it versus the underbelly, which I want to have more of a cool kind of vibe to it. It just makes it less flat in my opinion, to have some temperature variation, so that it also just adds a bit of interest as well. It was something that I was trying to figure out how I wanted to do. So one thing that I ended up deciding in the end was to apply the layers as gradients and then go in the opposite direction with the darks later, and I'm pretty happy with how that ended up going. From this point onward, it was just to keep going. You have an idea of where you're going with it, just keep trusting it, and it's all going to come together in the end. And it was the hoping moment. It was once I started applying the final layers to the body and to the wings that I could really start seeing it come together, and it actually starts happening quite quickly once that gets going, and it starts to be very, very satisfying. It's satisfying to paint these bits anyway, but it's satisfying in more of like a in the moment satisfaction, whereas when I can see the final layers bringing a piece together, that's like a different kind of satisfaction for me when I'm doing paintings and illustrations like this, or just paintings and illustrations and drawings in general. I left in a drying time bit here just for you to watch as well as a side tangent, just to show you that drying shift in the wings. But yeah, back to what I was saying, it's very satisfying to me to see the final layers sort of stitch together everything I've done, because it's one thing to have all of the different layers, the different textures and things as their own elements or as half finished elements, and having that final thing just tying them together is just, oh, it's yes, I love it so much. So that's where we're getting at now. I'm starting to apply that, and as you can see, as I mentioned, I'm going in the opposite direction. So I'm putting in from the base of the feather towards the tip. I'm applying some in like dots that I'm softening out, but I'm not trying to get too much texture at the same time. It's going to be quite textured. I'm trying to figure out how to word this. I'm trying to look for some texture, but I don't want it to be very like intense. I want there to be some interesting textures going on, but I want them to be a mixture of mostly softened out but with some hard edges, and for it to just be an interesting texture. That was my kind of goal with these. It's not something I've ever tried to do before, as far as I can recall, by applying like a gradient on one end that I texture out and then a gradient on the other that I texture out, and try and have some of the layers underneath show through in the textures that I'm building up. It's similar to how I've been learning to paint trees and things like that. It's a similar process, but I'm not trying to get the same texture out of it. One moment, I need to let the cat out. There we go. She's been asleep in the room for hours, and I didn't want to shuffle her out of the room when I closed it to record. So yeah, that's she finally wanted out. She wants to get up and eat, but I'm sure she appreciated being left to sleep. Anyway, where was I before being interrupted? We're on the final layers, so let's go with that. I still needed to do the final layers on the body of the raven, but I'm going in with the final layer on the wings at the moment, which was to just add some shadow separation between each of the feathers. This was the moment that I really started to see what I had envisioned coming together on the paper, at least to the best of my ability right now. I still need to go in with the body final layers, but also the string. And for the string, I knew that I wanted to have it wrapping around the feet as if it is actual string wrapping around. And I knew that I could either go in with masking it off from the start or using an opaque medium. So I decided to go with the opaque option and go in with gouache. I don't have the right hue of red that I wanted for the gouache, and also the two red pigments I do have, which is Quinacridone Rose PB19 and a red that I cannot remember right now. Those mix together to not produce the hue I'm wanting to. So what I decided to do was get one of my watercolours and mix that with the orange leaning red that I have in the gouache, and I hoped that together it would be the right hue and also the right opacity to do the string, and it ended up working out perfectly for me. And it was very satisfying to do, but it was also one of the most terrifying things to do, because It's very thin, you're working with a tiny brush, and it's also the final element. You're doing it in gouache and it is bright red. It is the you cannot fluff this up moment. So it was so satisfying, but I was also holding my breath the entire time I was doing it. And I'm so happy with how it ended up coming out. As a whole, I really enjoyed pretty much the whole process of this. I did have the issues at the start with the paper just rejecting the watercolor, and I'm gonna figure out what's going on with that, because as I mentioned earlier in the video, I've not really come across that in the other Baohong papers I've used before. So I'm just gonna see if it's a thing with the whole block in general, or if it's just been the first few sheets, if I need to treat the paper differently than how I treat other papers. I'll figure it out. But for the rest of the painting, I had a really nice time doing it, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm really happy with the result. So you can see me here picking out the paints, and I ended up mixing that Mission Gold with the orange, the red orange gouache that I have. I just used one of my little ceramic palettes that I tend to use for when I'm painting with gouache or when I'm using some watercolours straight from the tube. And it worked out really well. It was the right kind of hue I wanted. And I apologize, you can see some of my head leaning in there. But I was holding my breath and I was 100% focused on getting the string right, that I probably didn't factor in where the camera was and where my head is. Thank you for hanging out with me. If you did join along and do any painting, drawing, or whatever it might be of your own, let me know what you got up to in the comments. This is the final result. I waited until I could have some natural lighting to actually show the final result. I'm so happy with it, but thank you for watching, thank you for hanging out with me, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye!